In our last video, we ended up with, Lincoln being assassinated, and and the moderate Republicans becoming more and more minority, because there's so much resentment, so much strong feelings, and so much loss during this war that both sides were becoming quite polarized. And so we have Lincoln assassinated, and then we get up to this election in 1866. And the radical Republicans, remember, the radical Republicans were the ones that were very determined to ensure that the South would never rebel again, that they couldn't institute slavery again. They passed the 13th Amendment. The southern states who wanted to become part of the Union again had to accept this amendment. Then they got into the 14th Amendment, and they were just determined that by law the South would not be able to institute or have slavery at all, and to really kind of mold the South into a totally new type of vision, into their vision or culture. So the radical Republicans were elected as a majority in Congress, and what that means is they had the most votes. So their plans, their ideas, the things they wanted to see accomplished, they had enough votes to ensure that they would be passed and it would be implemented. And so they put together the Radical Reconstruction Act, and this act had a lot of ramifications to it. First of all, when the war ended and states were, in the southern states that seceded, they had to develop a whole new state legislature. They had to come up with a new constitution, and there were a lot of requirements that they said in order to become part of the Union again. Now, under this Radical Reconstruction Act, these radical Republicans were not really keen on all these Southerners that, let's say, supported the rebellion, fought against the North, and now being in control of the government of these southern states, as these states do what's necessary to become part of the Union. And so they decide, you know what, we're not really feeling it with these Southerners. So they decided that the civil authorities in the territories, we don't really trust these guys. They are going to be under military supervision. So the North is going to send down the military supervisors to ensure that these Southerners are doing what is required of them. Now, how does that make the Southerners feel? They've lost, their territory's decimated, their whole way of life is now being changed. And so they're not feeling the love for this military that conquered them, or the people who are sending them. They required new state constitutions. Some of the states after the war had already created their constitutions, but now under this federal law, they're saying in order for you to be a part of the Union, you have to have black suffrage. That means that blacks, these slaves, these freedmen now, have the right to vote. And that you have to ratify the 13th and 14th Amendments. We insist on this. This is what you have to do. Well, every human being in the world, a lot of times when you hear, this is what you have to do, there's a cringe. You kind of go, ooh. And for the South, it was more than a cringe. It was a real animosity. So they said, Southern states, these are your new requirements. This is what you will have to do. So in March 1867, Congress passed an act that authorized the military to enroll eligible black voters and to begin the process of constitution making. And so understand, they authorized the military. So you have all these freed blacks, and the ones that, remember, women didn't have the right to vote. So the freed blacks that were given the right to vote, they qualified, the military is ensuring that they are registered and now can vote. And how these states begin to develop these new constitutions. So instead of the South kind of trying to figure it out, there was a heavy hand, at least this is how the South saw it, a heavy hand on them that's pushing them and kind of directing them how they were going to do this. The federal Reconstruction took the vote away from 10,000 to 15,000 white men who were Confederate officers. So you really need to pull back and go, these were men that grew up in a culture that slavery, and many of them probably owned slaves, was just acceptable, right? It was what they've always known. And now, those slaves can vote, but they can't. So just there is such resentment in all this. The radical Republicans passed the Military Reconstruction Act, and here's a map of the different military districts that the Northern Army, they were in charge of. Now what that means is these Southerners who lived in this area, who were elected to their local, not Congress, a local legislature, they really ultimately, they could make the decisions, rewrite their constitution, but ultimately it needed to be brought before this military command, and you know, they are looking at what they're doing and ensuring that they get their approval. So the Southerners are very resentful of this. Divide the North into military territories, the Southerners were highly resentful of their loss of control over their southern territories. Ultimately, they had to go to the northern authorities to get approval for everything they planned to do. Very, very resentful. We don't have our rights. We don't. So there's still, even though the war ended, no law can touch the resentment or the attitude or the perspective people have. It can't change that. And this is what we see with Reconstruction. The radical Republicans did not like Johnson. He was much more moderate than they were. He didn't agree with much of the legislation. And so the radical Republicans had the majority, and they thought, what the heck? We're going to impeach him. And remember what we talked about earlier when we talked about the Constitution. To be impeached means to be charged with a crime, not convicted. So the House of Representatives will impeach someone. That means they will charge him with a formal charge. And then in the Senate, there is the trial and the vote. And he was acquitted by one vote. So he barely stayed in office. In the next video, we'll see what happens next.